There's something nostalgically romantic about a narrowboat slowly travelling the waterways of Great Britain. Passers-by stop to watch, fascinated as colourful traditional craft cruise on by at an enviable pace which belongs to an era long forgotten by the modern world. It's hard to believe that this peaceful, tranquil method of transport was designed for commercial purposes, playing a major part in the growth of the Industrial Revolution, which covered England's green and pleasant lands with dark smoke, belching mills and factories, drawing country people to the towns. Canal Mania, as it was described at the height of the waterway's success at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, was, however, a short-lived phenomenon, with the advent of steam power and the railways rapidly leaving the canals redundant. Although a few canals remained in use until the 1960s, many fell into disrepair, and it was only when post-Second World War prosperity and leisure hours found people looking for recreational activities that interest in the canals was rekindled, and narrowboating holidays became popular. The waterways were in a terrible state, often overgrown, polluted and filled with rubbish, but the basic structure was still intact, untouched in effect for over 200 years. The job of restoration was enormous and constantly ongoing, but the results have been well worth the effort, and these pictures certainly speak for themselves. The story of the canals is very interesting, and understanding how the system came into being is surprisingly useful for the would-be traveller. The idea of using waterways for transportation dates back to Roman times, but it's the Bridgewater Canal at Manchester, opened in 1761, that is considered to be the earliest example of a British canal. There were two men responsible for this milestone in transport history. The instigator was the wealthy Duke of Bridgewater, who owned collieries at Worsley, some 7 miles from Manchester. Obviously, Manchester was the ideal place to sell his coal, but the high cost of carrying it there on horseback meant he had few customers able to afford his prices. It's been said that the Duke was unlucky in love, and after being jilted, he threw all his energies into his business affairs. The Duke called in James Brindley to build him a canal to transport his coal from Worsley to Manchester. It was at first glance a bizarre appointment, as Brindley was an illiterate Derbyshire millwright who retired to his bed to consider difficult engineering problems. But the man was a practical genius, completely self-taught, and his canal was an absolute masterpiece. There were no locks, and the distance was relatively short, but a huge 40-foot aqueduct was built over the River Irwell, preceded by an embankment 900 yards long with 15 miles of canal, later extended to 42, actually built underground so that the boats could be loaded at the coal face. The canal was a huge success. Despite the Duke spending the modern equivalent of millions, he still made a handsome profit. Coal prices in Manchester halved immediately, and the Duke had plenty of custom for his coal. Brindley went down in the history books as an engineering celebrity and was in constant demand to build canals to link the major rivers of England, the Thames, Severn, Mersey and Trent. Sadly, like many engineers that would follow him, Brindley was a victim of his own achievements, dying of overwork in 1772, 5 years before his Grand Trunk Canal was completed in 1777. These early canals were dug out entirely by hand, using groups of itinerant workers drawn by the good rates of pay. They formed working parties and were known as navigators, which is where the widely used term navvies comes from today. The channels for the canals were as narrow as possible, to a maximum depth of 4 feet in the middle and less on either side. This kept digging to a minimum, but more importantly, Brindley recognised the importance of water conservation. If the water supply became threatened, then the canal couldn't function. To carry vessels up or down different levels, Brindley used locks, which were again kept as narrow as possible. Another tactic, which the modern traveller will notice, is that when approaching a bridge, the canal will always become narrow. This was a clever ploy to keep building costs to a minimum, making the bridge span and therefore the bridge as small as possible. These miniature bridges are an attractive characteristic of many English canals. Many people imagine life on canals in those early days as idyllic, with whole families living together, travelling on the water, transporting goods from one major city or port to the next. In fact, the real story was far from pleasant, with boats operated entirely by male crews, who were well known for their rough and ready dispositions. It was only when the railways took much of the canal's business that families started to accompany the men, as a cut in wages made it impossible to house them in any other way. It was therefore only in the late 19th century, when the number of families living afloat had increased, that boat painting became a traditional waterways art. It was more than an attractive form of decoration. Each symbol had a specific meaning, providing an extensive vocabulary and sign language that the land-based world knew nothing about. Modern narrowboats, which are still built to Brindley's original design, are often decorated with these traditional pictures. Castles and roses are the most popular, but the meanings have been lost, as the canal families that lived their entire lives within the confines of a narrowboat have long since disappeared. The inland navigable waterways of Great Britain are made up of both rivers and canals, and for those who want to try narrowboating, there are many companies that hire boats at strategic points throughout the system. For this programme, the boat has come from Stroudwater Cruisers based at Stourport-on-Severn, and it's come south by way of the river to Worcester to join the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, which has many interesting features, as well as being a great place to start narrowboating. Picking up the boat is usually done at a leisurely pace, with an expert on hand to run through all the technical bits. It's a good idea to have become familiar with what's involved beforehand, as obviously there's quite a lot to take in, particularly for novices. Planning a practical route so that everyone knows what they're trying to achieve is also a great help, as calculating canal miles and locks and timings takes a little practice, and an expert eye cast over the plans is always worth taking advantage of. Once out on the open water, there are a few basics that everyone needs to know, and there are some excellent publications that are useful to have on board for reference. Also, an Ordnance Survey Guide, which contains navigation maps, is invaluable, as it not only shows the route, it also notes where facilities are available along the way. Getting used to the pace of narrowboating can be a bit of a shock, albeit a pleasant one, to most people's systems. The speed limit on the canals is 4 miles an hour, which is best described as equivalent to a reasonably brisk walk. As already discussed, canals are surprisingly shallow, and there are times when even 4 miles an hour is too fast, particularly where canals have become silted up. Boats travelling above this speed aggravate the problem further, as they'll cause excessive wash, which in turn erodes the banks and makes the canal even shallower. If a boat is creating a wash that breaks against the banks, it's going too fast. The basic rule is, if in doubt, slow down. It's common courtesy to other waterway users. Anglers often fish from the banks, and other boats moor up to enjoy the beauty of the countryside. The last thing anyone wants is to be bashed about by another boat's wash, and their displeasure will be evident and definitely not conducive to a peaceful holiday. Always slow down on bends, coming up to bridges, locks, and other boats. For general cruising, it's best to travel through the central channel of the canal, which is where the water is deepest. When another boat is travelling in the opposite direction, both drivers should slow down and pass on the right, but not too close to the bank, otherwise they might run aground. As long as there's at least a couple of feet between the passing boats, there shouldn't be a problem. If it's impossible to pass on the right, the correct procedure is to sound 2 short blasts on the compulsory horn to indicate passing on the left. Overtaking is done on the left at normal speed, but remember, the boat that's being overtaken has the right of way. This, though, is to be avoided on bends, near a bridge or lock, and only attempted when the way ahead is clear. When being overtaken, slow down and keep a steady course. Most narrowboats are steered by means of a tiller, when the propeller is moving the boat forward. Unlike steering a car, the boat's tiller is operated by pushing to the right when wanting to go to the left, and vice versa. The boat pivots from the centre when turning, so watch out for the back swinging out. Navigation at night is not encouraged. British waterways request that locks are not used after dark, and most hire boat operators don't usually permit cruising beyond dusk. On the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, there are some delightful flights of locks. For all canal travellers, locks are a fact of life, and whether they add or detract from the holiday depends on how they are approached. In the brief canal history at the beginning of this programme, the function of the lock was described as enabling boats to move up or down differing water levels. Understanding how a lock operates is definitely the key to making the most of these major works of engineering, ensuring that they are incorporated into the holiday as an added attraction. Think of the lock as a box with gates at either end. The lower water level is at the bottom, and the higher water level is at the top. By either filling the box up with water, or alternatively emptying it out, a narrowboat can be transported between two different levels at will. The water is controlled by means of paddles, which either open or shut holes in the gates or open and shut underground culverts. The easiest way to explain this is to consider the paddles at the bottom end of the lock as the plugs and the paddles at the top as the taps. If the lock is full of water and needs to be emptied, then the paddles at the bottom of the lock are raised, just like pulling a plug from a bath of water. If the lock is empty and needs to be filled up, then the paddles at the top of the lock are raised, which in effect turns on the taps to fill it. Just like a bath, it's no good putting on the taps with the plug out, so a logical sequence is required to ensure water doesn't get wasted. When a narrowboat approaches a lock, it can either be stopped and tied up while the lock is worked, or, as is more often the case, another member of the party can be put ashore with a windlass, sometimes known as a lock key, to operate the paddles and open the lock for the boat to drive straight in. Boats either go into a lock from the bottom, which is called locking up, or from the top, which is logically called locking down, and in this section of the programme both procedures will be demonstrated. Firstly then, locking up. If the last boat to go through was coming in the opposite direction, then this is fortunate, because the lock will have been emptied and the water will be at the lower level. The rule of the waterways decrees that when a lock has been used, the departing boat should lower all paddles and close all gates, and most of the time this is the case. This means that whoever is working the lock should find the lock empty and the gates shut with the paddles down. The gates can then be opened while the boat is driven carefully in, and once safely inside, the gates can be closed. Returning to the bath analogy, because the paddles are down, the plug is in and the taps can be turned on. The paddles at the top of the lock can then be raised by turning the spindle with a lock key. Some of the locks encountered are very old, and although every effort is made to keep the paddles in good order, they can be quite stiff. Make sure that they're not dropped, and when lowering, they should be treated with care. Once opened, the water will rush into the lock and the boat will start to rise. This is magical to see and is guaranteed to have passers-by stopping to watch. When the water level has reached the top, it's then possible to push the gates open. One tip here: don't try to push the gates open before they're ready. It can't be done and is a terrible strain on the back. Wait until movement is detected, then push away. With the gate open, the boat can pull out of the lock, the paddles can be wound back down and the gates closed. If another boat is coming down into the lock, it's okay to leave the gates open for them to drive straight in. Another important tip: don't leave the key on the paddle handle while waiting for the lock to fill. If something went wrong and the paddle slipped, the key would fly off and could cause severe damage to anyone or anything in close proximity. Also, don't leave your lock key behind. Thousands are lost this way every year. If the last boat to go through was also locking up, the box will be full of water and needs to be emptied. When this happens, it's important to check the top of the lock to see whether another boat is waiting to come down. Where possible, water should be conserved, and it's far better to let them come through first, as the lock needs to be emptied anyway. If there's no sign of another boat, check that the top gate is closed and the paddles are down. The bottom paddles can then be raised to let the water out, and the bottom gates can be opened for the procedure to begin. A last cautionary tip here. Take care when moving from one side of the lock to the other. There are steps on the top of the gates and sometimes handrails, but in wet and icy conditions they can get very slippery. Never jump across open gates. Full locks are deep and it's very easy to fall against the steep stone sides. It just isn't worth the risk when it only takes a few seconds to walk round. Locking down is exactly the same as locking up, but the procedure is reversed. Again, logical application is the important thing to remember. Just as in locking up, it will depend on the direction of the last boat through to determine whether the lock is full of water or empty. If it's full, at the high water level, the top gates can be opened immediately for the boat to drive in. Then close the top gates and check that the paddles are down. Whether travelling up or down, it's always worth keeping the boat near the bottom gates whilst in the lock so as to avoid hitting the sill that the top gates sit upon. It can't be seen when the lock is full of water, but it does protrude between 2 and 5 feet and can do considerable damage to the stern of a boat. Next job is to empty the lock by raising the bottom paddles, and then the gates can be opened for the boat to drive out. Close the gates and drop the paddles. If the lock is empty upon arrival at the upper level, check the bottom gates and paddles before opening the top paddles to fill the lock. Once full, the top gate can be opened and the boat can drive in and the emptying process can begin. There are some general do's and don'ts regarding locks which will make the whole process a lot safer for everyone. Don't leave the key on the paddle spindle, it can cause injury. Do always leave paddles and gates closed when finished. Do wind the paddles down, please don't let them drop. Don't rush around locks, especially in slippery conditions. Don't jump across half-open gates. And lastly, remember that the whole process can be stopped at any time by closing the paddles to deal with any emergency. It does take a few locks to get confident with the techniques, and then it all becomes great fun. Any children in the party will thoroughly enjoy working the locks, but safety needs to be of paramount importance. Life jackets are always a good idea, and adult supervision is essential. Canal maps show the lock positions, keeping everyone informed about what's coming up. After all, it's no good putting the kettle on for tea if there's a flight of locks ahead. It's hard to predict how long it'll take to go through a lock, as there are too many intangibles, whether the lock is full or empty, how many people there are to operate the paddles, their level of experience, and of course the lock may already be in use, with other boats waiting. A fair guide is about 8 minutes per lock, but be patient if other boat users seem to be slower than this. Road rage is an unpleasant development for the car driver, and hopefully it'll never become an issue on the waterways, where the slower pace of life is much appreciated. As the canals are very narrow, an issue that can sometimes cause problems for other boat users is mooring. There are designated moorings where bollards and rings are provided, but as metal stakes can be used to secure the boat just about anywhere, those who want to find the quieter, more private mooring spots are at liberty to do so. Taking care to abide by these few simple rules will avoid any difficulties. Avoid mooring anywhere that might obstruct others, such as on a bend or a narrow stretch. There are often bollards and rings on the bank approaching a lock and within flights, They are temporary moorings for boats waiting to go through, and like the lock itself, should never be used for overnight stays. Don't ever be tempted to tie up in a tunnel or under a bridge, and always make sure there's a reasonable depth of water. Last, but not least, beware of mooring at unrecognised sites in towns and cities, where vandalism of boats can be a problem. This is definitely enough information to get started. Everyone will pick up things at their own pace, working out their own way of doing stuff. After just a few miles and a handful of locks, most people are able to relax and enjoy a little waterway magic. The lock demonstrations were well along the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, and for the purpose of this programme the boat will now be taken up to a winding hole where it can be turned round. This lovely old canal was not actually built by James Brindley, as work began in 1791, nearly 20 years after his death. However, his influence is unmistakable, particularly the miniature bridges which are made out of the attractive local red sandstone. By the time this canal was completed, Stephenson was already experimenting with steam, and the railway age was well on its way. From 1864, the canal struggled to make a profit, and it was sold to the Sharpness New Docks Company. This proved useful to Cadbury's in the early part of the 20th century, linking the main Bourneville factory on the outskirts of Birmingham with their Frampton factory to the south of the city of Gloucester. The canal was never successful as a commercial venture, and there were several attempts to abandon it, but the increase in holiday traffic in the 1960s secured its future. Now people from all over the world are able to enjoy this restored waterway, which is a vital part of the routes incorporating the rivers Severn and Avon with the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal, Birmingham Canal navigations, and the picturesque Stratford-on-Avon Canal. Once the boat has reached Stoke Prior, the northernmost point on this journey, the turnaround can be carefully completed. To continue northwards would take travellers on to Kings Norton and Birmingham, but the route for this programme will follow the Worcester and Birmingham Canal south to Worcester, continuing south after Diglis Basin into the River Severn to visit the historic docks at Gloucester, before finally heading north back up the river to return the boat to Stourport. It's worth pausing here to watch the turnaround, which in boating terms is known as winding. Where a narrowboat is longer than the width of the canal, the best place to turn around is a winding hole, and these are clearly marked on waterway maps. It's sometimes possible to turn at canal junctions, but be warned, these can be busy places, particularly in the summer. Here, the entire operation appears to be executed with great ease. However, this is down to experience, helped by Stoke Prior having a reasonable amount of space in which to turn a 60-foot narrowboat. This means that there's no need for the boat to be driven into the shallow water at the edge of the canal, where there's always a danger of running aground. Think carefully about the course you are taking, and remember that reversing a narrowboat is one of the more demanding tasks due to the nature of the beast, and must be done slowly in order to keep the craft under control. As you can see, it's easy when you know how, but it's wiser to plan a route that doesn't require winding until the driver's had a chance to get used to handling the boat. Some people prefer to avoid the process altogether, planning circular routes through the waterway system, eliminating the need to ever turn the boats around. Stoke Prior is certainly at its best from the canal, with a traditional wharf and warehouse and some pretty creeper-clad cottages. This was the heart of the old village, drawn to the canal side in the late 18th century. The rural landscape, which can be seen in the distance at this point, is preceded by a large, mostly derelict chemical factory. Stoke Works, built in 1828 to pump brine from underground deposits, provided salt for a variety of industrial uses. The canal passes through the middle of the now blackened works, which it served for a very short time. The railways quickly took over the lucrative transportation of the salt, thanks to greater speed and efficiency. A waterside pub, appropriately named the Boat and Railway, soon appears, making a much more attractive view for travellers. And as with all pubs that edge the canal, there are excellent moorings for those who wish to partake of refreshment. Pubs are a popular topic of conversation with narrowboaters meeting as they operate locks, and word soon spreads as to which offer the best beer, pies, chips, and of course, hospitality. Passing the pub, the Worcestershire countryside starts to open out as the boat travels into a very picturesque landscape. A popular spot for anglers and boaters, the journey begins a descent through the 6 Astwood locks. Open pasture land stretches out on either side, and it's hard to believe that the busy M5 motorway is just a few miles to the west. The penultimate lock in the Astwood flight is particularly attractive, with a traditional lock-keeper's cottage overlooking it. The cottage stands one side, and on the opposite side a pretty garden stretches some distance along the canal. A bridge across the water leads to Hanbury Hall, a fine red brick National Trust property. There's a very pleasant footpath from the canal side which takes walkers via a circular route to the hall, and many people are happy to moor up here for a few hours to enjoy this land-based excursion. Beyond the Astwood flight, travellers can relax and enjoy a 5.5-mile stretch of waterway without a single lock. The countryside is beautiful, typical of rural England, embellished with a fine selection of sandstone dwellings which are so characteristic of the area. This is a good opportunity to point out some of the more welcome additions to modern-day narrowboating. The landscape in this particular stretch of canal has changed little since the early navigators travelled this way, and from the outside the narrowboats look as traditional as ever. However, an interior, equipped with full-sized cooker, fridge, electric light, hot shower, toilet, central heating, television and comfy beds adds considerably to the experience, allowing holidaymakers to really enjoy all of the nostalgia without having to encounter any of the hardships. Life on narrowboats must be good, because Hanbury Wharf, which is the next settlement along, has plenty of permanently moored craft, and the fine displays of pot plants and paraphernalia indicate the residential nature of these houseboats. This is an example of the type of location mentioned earlier in the programme, where boats need to really slow down. The central channel is even narrower here, due to the moored boats, and visitors creating too much wash or bumping along the sides as they go past will cause considerable annoyance. The Hanbury Wharf settlement grew up initially when the Droitwich Canal was cut in 1852. At the present time this is unnavigable, but work is being carried out to restore the Droitwich Canal to its former glory, and this will again become a valuable addition to the waterways of this area. After passing Hanbury Wharf, the next feature of the canal is a favourite for all narrowboaters. The Dunhampstead Tunnel is one of 5 on the Worcester and Birmingham, and at 236 yards in length it's quite impressive. When boats travelled under horsepower, the fact that there was no towpath through the tunnel forced the horses to walk over the hill while the crewmen pulled the boat through. In many of the tunnels, the only way to achieve this was by legging, where boards were placed on the top of the boats for crewmen to lie on, using their feet against the walls of the tunnel to push the boat through. This could be exhausting in some of the longer tunnels, and with water dripping down from the ceiling, most uncomfortable. The Dunhampstead Tunnel had the added convenience of handrails for the crewmen to pull the boat through, giving them a much easier time, and the rails can still be seen today running along each side of the tunnel. For the modern traveller, no physical exertions are needed when passing through a tunnel, but there are just a few points to consider. Firstly, switch on the headlight and some of the internal lights, but not to the detriment of the skipper's sight. Before driving into the tunnel, check whether it has sufficient width for two-way traffic, and if not, make sure that no other boat is coming in the opposite direction. Even on a fine day, it's worth putting on waterproofs, as tunnels are damp and the ceilings drip. When entering a tunnel, sound one long blast on the horn. This will alert other tunnel users. Also, make sure that if another boat is in front, leave a distance of about 2 minutes at normal cruising speed. Never overtake in a tunnel, and if passing oncoming boats, slow right down and pass on the right. The only reason anyone should ever stop in a tunnel is if they've broken down. In such an event, turn off the engine and sound long blasts on the horn to attract attention. Never attempt to swim out, but it's worth trying to push the boat out using a pole. If the lights have also failed, arrows that glow in the dark show the shortest route out. The tunnel at Dunhampstead is relatively short, and the leafy banks and light at the end quickly appear. One of the most beautiful sights to be seen from a narrowboat is a dark tunnel archway framing a brightly lit rural landscape. This cannot be experienced in any other way and is a rare treat that'll never be forgotten. Back out in the sunshine, the Worcestershire countryside is at its prettiest. Dunhampstead is in fact a tiny hamlet, but there's a popular pub where ghost stories about a murdered vicar who walks the towpath are told, much to the delight of visiting narrowboaters who have reportedly heard his haunting footsteps as they return to the canal. The run of locks between Dunhampstead and Worcester are paced at very pleasant intervals, giving travellers a chance to really enjoy the countryside before the city outskirts encroach upon the canal. Sadly, the city of Worcester has done little to make the most of the canal, with the commandery at the King's Head Lock being one of the only features of note. There are moorings right outside this impressive timbered building, which served as Charles Stuart's headquarters before the Battle of Worcester in 1651, and it's well worth a visit. To leave the Worcester and Birmingham Canal and return to the River Severn, the boat needs to pass through Diglis Basin. Surrounded by boatyards and old warehouses, narrowboats have to be taken through 2 wide locks before reaching the river. The mechanics of the wide lock are exactly the same as in the narrower versions encountered on the canal, with the bottom paddles acting as a plug and the top paddles acting as a tap. However, there are a few extra considerations, particularly when locking up. If the top paddles were fully opened at the same time, the boat would be buffeted quite considerably. To avoid this, take the boat into the lock and secure the bow line to a bollard or ring leading back from the bows. Then open the paddles on the same side as the boat first. By allowing the lock to empty slowly in this way, the circulation of water created will hold the boat tight on the bowline and hard against the side of the lock. Once held firm, the remaining paddle can be opened, but gently, otherwise the circulation can still be disrupted. If Worcester has failed to make the most of its historic canal and waterway connections, Gloucester, some 30 miles south, by way of the River Severn, has, in contrast, achieved a great deal. The docks, which are large enough to accommodate ocean-going ships, are famous for the restored warehouses, which were used to store grain and timber, the main commodities imported to Gloucester. One of the warehouses is now home to the Waterways Museum, with the Robert Opie Package Museum in a neighbouring warehouse. There's also a tiny church tucked between the warehouses. This was the Mariners' Chapel, which served the religious needs of the sailors who passed through the docks. Frequently, visitors will feel that they've stepped back in time, as the docks are a very popular film location, with tall ships and costumed actors making their way through the narrow passages. Much of the BBC series, The Aeneid Line, was filmed here, with a stunning ship called the Charlotte Rose, and local people quickly grew accustomed to the sight of Victorian extras drinking coffee in the local cafes. Gloucester Docks have now become a major tourist attraction, with a wide variety of shops and restaurants, all of which complement the historic surroundings. Leaving Gloucester to turn north back up the River Severn towards Stourport, it's a good time to consider the differences between canal and river travel. The river is obviously wider and much deeper where it is navigable, and accordingly the speed limit is higher than on canals. On this river, the speed limit is 6 miles per hour upstream and 8 miles per hour downstream. Current is very important to the calculation of journey times, as it can sometimes take up to half as long again to head upstream over the same distance covered downstream. Travellers must also be aware that heavy rain can quickly put rivers into flood, a problem that doesn't affect the canals, and when this happens, cruising on the river is prohibited. Boats need to moor up safely and wait for the water to subside. Flood warning systems are in operation, and the local British Waterways office will always give advice. The locks on the rivers are much larger than those found on canals, and a number of boats can pass through at any one time. There are usually traffic lights to control entry, and they are invariably operated by lock keepers. The lock opening times may vary. Keepers often take an hour for lunch, so it's always worth checking things out, otherwise there may be a long wait to proceed with a journey. Once inside the lock, it's necessary to hold on to the ropes, chains or rods positioned on the walls, or alternatively, pass a rope from the boat around one of them. The lockkeeper may also ask for a rope to be thrown up to him so that it can be secured around a bollard at the top. Although river locks are very straightforward and require little effort, they do not have the atmosphere of the traditional narrow locks, nor do they share the beautiful and tranquil surroundings. Back up the River Severn beyond Worcester, the stretch between here and Stourport has some attractive features. The reach from Lenchford is lovely, with the river flowing through a well-defined valley made up of steep wooded hills on either bank. This is particularly noticeable at Lincoln Lock, the last before Stourport, where the hills almost hang over the river. The outlook is spoiled from here due to an abandoned oil wharf with rusty pipes and terminals. Nevertheless, an unexpected and dramatic outcrop of crumbling sandstone at Redstone Rock on the opposite side of the river is adequate compensation. Stourport Power Station then comes into view, and Journey's End appears with the locks that will take the boat into Stourport Basin, the home of Stroudwater cruisers. As a town, Stourport grew up around the canal. In the early 1760s, when James Brindley was surveying the line for the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal, he initially proposed that the meeting point with the River Severn should be at Bewdley, about 4 miles further north. However, the residents of this well-established riverport turned their noses up at Brindley's stinking ditch and refused to have any part of it. Brindley then looked for an alternative, choosing the little hamlet of Lower Mitton, where the River Stour flowed into the Severn and Stourport was born. The last locks into Stourport Basin are approached with mixed feelings. There are few experiences in life as satisfactory as the completion of a narrowboat journey. With delays caused by the elements for which even the modern traveller has little control, and time taken to just sit and watch the world go by, reaching a chosen destination is always an achievement. The disappointment comes from the fact that the adventure is over and stepping back onto dry land feels very strange, especially having to get back into a car when even the sleepy town of Stourport seems like a race circuit. It takes such a short time to relax into the pace of narrowboat life, and seeing the English countryside from a transport system that has changed little since the 18th century is a rare privilege. But there's always next time, and it has to be said that most people who give narrowboating a try come back time and time again. This relatively short journey from Stourport to Worcester on the River Severn, up the Worcester and Birmingham Canal to Stoke Prior and back again, is a very pleasant trip for getting started. For the more adventurous, this can be extended by continuing up the Worcester and Birmingham Canal through the massive Tardybig flight of locks to Kings Norton Junction, into the Stratford-on-Avon Canal to Stratford on the River Avon, down to Tewkesbury and back onto the River Severn to return to Stourport. Known as the Avon Ring, this is very easily achieved in 10 to 14 days, with narrowboaters managing it comfortably within a week if river conditions are favourable. There are canals all over Great Britain, and each one offers a unique view of the surrounding countryside. Each year, disused canals are restored and brought back to life, extending the navigable miles available to the narrowboat enthusiast. As a leisure activity, the peace and tranquility remains unrivaled, hardly what James Brindley anticipated when his plans for an inland waterway system were conceived as a commercial venture. However, he would undoubtedly be delighted that his engineering work has lasted over 200 years, and more importantly, the canals have an assured future, thanks to the thousands of holidaymakers who will continue to enjoy the magic of the waterways for many years to come.